On June 12, 1943, 11:47 a.m., Flight Lieutenant Anthony Hill sat alone in the interpretation room, hunched over a light table, his eyes burning from 3 consecutive hours of scrutinizing aerial photographs. Outside, the Spitfire that had delivered these images was already being refueled. Inside, Hill worked through frame after frame of German coastline, harbors, factories, rail junctions, the usual tactical inventory of a nation preparing for invasion or defending against one. He had examined 43 photographs that morning, 43 frames of occupied Europe, rendered in stark black and white, every shadow and structure frozen at 25,000 feet. His coffee had gone cold. His neck ached. And then, in frame 44, he saw something that didn't belong. A shape, cylindrical, horizontal, resting on what appeared to be a concrete ramp, angled toward the sky. Hill's hand stopped mid-motion, magnifying glass hovering over the image. The object measured roughly 35 feet in length, perhaps 4 feet in diameter, too large for conventional artillery, too sleek for a coastal defense gun, and it was pointed upward at an angle of approximately 45 degrees, as if waiting to launch something into the air. Hill felt his pulse quicken, not from excitement, but from the cold, creeping realization that he might be looking at something entirely new, something no Allied analyst had ever catalogued. He reached for the telephone, his fingers unsteady, and dialed the office of Wing Commander Douglas Kendall without taking his eyes off the photograph. The location was a place most British intelligence officers had never heard of, a spit of land on Germany's Baltic coast, isolated and heavily restricted even by Nazi standards, Peenemünde. It appeared on maps as a quiet fishing village, unremarkable and strategically irrelevant, but the photograph Hill held told a different story. Scattered across the frame were additional structures, massive concrete slabs, launch rails, storage depots, and what appeared to be a series of pressurized fuel tanks. This was no fishing village. This was an installation designed to do something the Allies had not yet conceived of. And whatever it was, the Germans had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep it hidden. Hill's call reached Kendall within 2 minutes. Kendall, a meticulous man with a reputation for cautious analysis, arrived in the interpretation room 7 minutes later. He said nothing as Hill handed him the magnifying glass and pointed to the cylindrical object on the ramp. Kendall studied it for 30 seconds, then straightened, his face unreadable. Where was this taken? Hill tapped the edge of the photograph. Peenemünde, northern coast. The Spitfire made a high-altitude pass yesterday evening. This is the only clear frame. Kendall set the glass down carefully. Get me every photograph we have of this area, everything from the last 6 months, and call Medmenham. Tell them we need Sarah Oliver and the photographic interpretation unit here within the hour. Hill nodded, already reaching for the phone again. Neither man said what they were both thinking, that if this was what it appeared to be, the war had just changed. Sarah Oliver arrived at RAF Benson at 1:15 p.m., carrying a leather satchel and wearing the quiet intensity of someone who had spent the last 2 years identifying German military installations from shadows and construction debris. She was one of the few women in British intelligence entrusted with top-level photographic analysis, and she had built her reputation on noticing details others missed. Kendall briefed her in less than 3 minutes, then handed her the photograph. Oliver placed it under the stereoscopic viewer, adjusting the focus until the landscape resolved into 3 dimensions. She said nothing for almost 4 minutes. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but cold. This isn't artillery. The angle's wrong. And look here. She pointed to a cluster of buildings adjacent to the ramp. Those are liquid oxygen tanks. You can tell by the frost patterns on the exterior walls. Whatever's on that ramp, it's being fueled with something cryogenic. Kendall leaned in. A rocket? Oliver didn't answer immediately. She moved the viewer across the photograph, noting the scale of the infrastructure, the placement of the fuel lines, the thickness of the concrete. If it is, she said quietly, it's unlike anything we've theorized. Look at the size of those storage facilities. If they're fueling rockets here, they're not launching one or two. They're preparing for mass production. Hill, standing behind them, felt a wave of nausea rise in his chest. Mass production of rockets. Aimed at what? London? The invasion fleet assembling in southern England? He thought of the Blitz, the thousands killed by conventional bombing, and imagined what a weapon like this could do if launched by the hundreds, by the thousands. Oliver straightened, pulling another photograph from her satchel. She brought this from the archive. It's from April, same area. She placed it beside Hill's frame. The earlier image showed the same ramp, but it was empty. No cylindrical object, no frost on the tanks, just raw concrete and construction scaffolding. Whatever this is, Oliver said, it's recent. They've been building it for months, and now they're testing it. Kendall's jaw tightened. We need confirmation. One photograph isn't enough to brief the chiefs of staff. Oliver met his gaze. Then we get more. Within 6 hours, requests went out to RAF reconnaissance squadrons across southern England. Peenemünde was added to the priority target list, flagged for daily overflights at maximum altitude. Pilots were ordered to approach from the north, minimizing detection risk, and to photograph the entire coastline in overlapping passes. The orders were marked urgent but carried no explanation. Most pilots assumed they were documenting U-boat construction or coastal defenses. None of them knew they were hunting for a weapon that could render the Allied invasion of Europe impossible. Over the next 11 days, 17 reconnaissance missions were flown over Peenemünde. 14 returned successfully. 3 were intercepted by German fighters and forced to abort. Of the missions that made it back, only 6 produced usable photographs. The weather over the Baltic in mid-June was unpredictable, and cloud cover frequently obscured the target. But the images that did come through were enough. Oliver and her team worked in shifts, cataloging every structure, every vehicle, every shadow. They identified 43 launch ramps, 11 storage depots, and what appeared to be a series of test range stretching 5 miles along the coast. They documented construction crews laying rail lines directly into the facility and calculated fuel consumption rates based on the number of tanker cars photographed in the rail yards. The numbers were staggering. If Peenemünde was preparing to launch rockets, it was preparing to launch them by the hundreds. On June 23rd, a new photograph arrived that changed everything. It was at dawn, when the light was low and shadows were long, and it captured something none of the previous frames had shown: a rocket in mid-launch. The image was grainy, motion-blurred at the edges, but unmistakable. A slender white column rising from one of the ramps, trailing fire and smoke, ascending at an angle so steep it looked almost vertical. The rocket was already 500 feet in the air when the camera shutter closed. Oliver calculated the velocity based on the blur pattern and exhaust plume. The rocket had accelerated to over 300 miles per hour in the first 3 seconds of flight. She ran the numbers again, certain she'd made an error. The result was the same. No aircraft in existence could match that acceleration. No conventional weapon could sustain that kind of thrust. This was something entirely new. Hill stood beside her, staring at the photograph. "Where's it going?" Oliver didn't look up. "Wherever they point it. London is less than 600 miles from Peenemünde. If that rocket maintains its trajectory and speed, it could reach the English coast in under 10 minutes. Hill felt his pulse quicken, not from excitement, but from the cold, creeping realization that he might be looking at something entirely new. Hill convened an emergency briefing at the Air Ministry on June 25th. The room was packed. Senior RAF officers, representatives from MI6, scientists from the Ministry of Supply, and a tight-lipped contingent from the Prime Minister's office. Kendall presented the photographs in chronological order, narrating each discovery with clinical precision. When he reached the launch photograph, the room went silent. One of the scientists, a man named Reginald Jones, stood and approached the projection screen. He studied the image for a long moment, then turned to face the room. "This is a liquid-fueled rocket. Based on the exhaust signature and ascent rate, it's likely using a combination of liquid oxygen and ethanol. If I'm correct, this weapon has a range of at least 200 miles, possibly more.
And if the Germans are building launch facilities on this scale, then they're not planning a demonstration, they're planning a campaign. The implications hung in the air like smoke. A campaign against London, against the invasion fleet, against every city and port within 600 miles of the German coast. One of the RAF officers, a group captain named Baker, cleared his throat. Can we intercept them? Jones shook his head. Not with conventional fighters. These rockets fly too high and too fast. By the time radar detects the launch, the weapon is already halfway to its target. Interception is effectively impossible. Baker's face darkened. Then what do we do? Jones looked at Kendall, then at the photograph on the screen. We destroy the facility, before they're operational, before they can launch.
The debate that followed was swift and brutal. Bombing Peenemünde would require a massive air raid, hundreds of bombers, long-range fighter escorts, and flawless timing to hit the facility before the Germans could disperse their research teams and equipment. The risks were immense. Peenemünde was over 600 miles from the nearest British airfield, deep in German-controlled airspace, and protected by some of the heaviest anti-aircraft defenses in Europe. Losses were expected to be catastrophic, but the alternative, allowing the rockets to become operational, was unthinkable. The decision went to Churchill himself. On July 7th, after reviewing the photographs and hearing Jones' assessment, the Prime Minister authorized Operation Hydra. The target, Peenemünde. The objective, total destruction. The raid was scheduled for the night of August 17, 1943. Nearly 600 bombers, Lancasters, Halifaxes, and Stirlings assembled over the North Sea in 3 massive waves. The plan was to hit the facility in stages, targeting the production halls first, then the residential barracks where the scientists and engineers were housed, and finally the launch ramps themselves. The goal was not just to destroy the rockets, but to cripple Germany's ability to build more, to kill the scientists who designed them, to erase Peenemünde from existence. The crews who flew that night were told only that they were attacking a secret weapons facility. They were not told what kind of weapons. They were not told how close Germany had come to making those weapons operational. They flew into the night without fully understanding what they were preventing. The raid began at 12:15 a.m. The first wave of bombers crossed the Danish coast at 20,000 feet, engines throttled back to reduce noise, navigators hunched over their maps in the dim red glow of cockpit lights. German radar detected them almost immediately, and within minutes, night fighters were scrambling from airfields across northern Germany. The Luftwaffe had been waiting for a raid like this, deep penetration, high-value target, and they came up in force. Messerschmitt 110s and Junkers 88s prowled the darkness, guided by ground controllers who tracked the bomber stream with cold efficiency. The first RAF aircraft went down over Rügen Island, hit by a night fighter's cannon fire, the bomber tumbling out of formation in flames. 2 more fell before the stream even reached Peenemünde. The crews inside had no time to bail out. They were gone before the rest of the formation knew they'd been hit. At 12:47 a.m., the first bombs fell. The lead wave targeted the production halls, massive concrete structures where the rockets were assembled, and the impact was immediate and devastating. High explosive bombs tore through the roofs, collapsing steel girders and igniting fuel stores inside. Secondary explosions rippled across the facility as pressurized tanks ruptured and liquid oxygen ignited in sheets of blue-white flame. The heat was so intense that crews in aircraft 3,000 feet overhead could feel it through their fuselages. One navigator, peering through the bomb bay, later described the scene as a vision of hell rendered in industrial precision. The fires burned so bright they were visible from Denmark, 40 miles away. The second wave arrived 12 minutes later, targeting the residential barracks. This was the most controversial part of the raid, bombing sleeping quarters, knowing that many inside were civilians, scientists, engineers, and support staff. But the British High Command had made a calculation. Killing the people who built the rockets was as important as destroying the rockets themselves. The bombs fell with mechanical indifference, obliterating entire blocks of housing. The death toll among German personnel that night would later be estimated at over 700. Many never woke up. Those who did found themselves trapped in collapsed buildings, surrounded by fire, choking in smoke and dust. The screams could be heard even over the roar of the bombers. The third wave hit the launch ramps and test facilities. These were hardened targets, reinforced with steel and thick concrete, and some survived the initial bombing runs. But the sheer tonnage of explosives dropped that night, over 1,800 tons, was enough to crack even the most heavily fortified structures. Launch ramps buckled and collapsed. Fuel tanks exploded in mushroom clouds that lit up the entire coastline. Rail lines were torn apart, scattering twisted metal across the landscape. By 1:30 a.m., Peenemünde was a smoking ruin. The facility that had taken 2 years and hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks to build had been effectively destroyed in 75 minutes. But the cost was high. 40 RAF bombers were lost that night, shot down by fighters, consumed by flak, or crippled by damage and forced to ditch in the North Sea. Over 250 airmen died. Some were killed instantly when their aircraft exploded. Others bailed out over enemy territory and were captured or killed on the ground. A few made it into life rafts and spent hours in freezing water, waiting for rescue that never came. The survivors who made it back to England landed at dawn, exhausted and shaken, knowing that many of their friends hadn't returned. In the debriefing rooms, they were told that the raid had been a success. They were not told what they had destroyed or why it mattered. That information remained classified. In the days following the raid, reconnaissance flights over Peenemünde confirmed the extent of the damage. The production halls were gone, the barracks were leveled, the launch ramps were destroyed or rendered inoperable. But buried in the rubble, British analysts found something troubling, evidence that not all of the rockets were at Peenemünde during the raid. Photographs showed empty storage depots and rail cars that had been recently moved. The Germans had dispersed some of their inventory before the attack, relocating components and personnel to underground facilities scattered across occupied Europe. The raid had crippled Peenemünde, but it hadn't ended the rocket program. It had only delayed it. By September 1943, German engineers had resumed production in new locations, hidden factories buried in mountains, camouflaged assembly plants in forests, launch sites disguised as farms or industrial warehouses. The V-2 rocket, as it would later be known, continued development under the direction of Werner Braun and his team, now working from dispersed sites that were harder to detect and harder to destroy. The British had bought time, but they hadn't won. The rockets would still come, and when they did, there would be no warning. The first V-2 struck London on September 8, 1944, more than a year after the Peenemünde raid. It fell without warning on Chiswick, a residential neighborhood in West London, killing 3 people and destroying several homes. There was no air raid siren, no sound of approaching aircraft, just a sudden catastrophic explosion, followed by the delayed sonic boom of the rocket breaking the sound barrier on its descent. Witnesses described hearing the boom after the impact, a terrifying reversal of cause and effect that made the weapon feel otherworldly. More rockets followed. For the next 7 months, Germany launched over 3,000 V-2s at Allied targets, killing an estimated 9,000 people and wounding many more. The rockets hit London, Antwerp, Paris, and other cities, striking with random, indiscriminate violence. There was no defense, no way to shoot them down, no way to predict where they would land. You simply lived under the threat, waiting to see if the next one would hit your street. But the scale of the attacks could have been far worse. Intelligence analysts later estimated that if Peenemünde had remained operational, Germany could have launched 10,000 V-2s by the end of 1944, enough to devastate every major city in southern England and cripple the Allied invasion effort before it began. It was a narrow margin, a matter of months, and it all hinged on a single photograph, frame 44, taken on June 12, 1943, by a pilot who never knew what he'd captured. Flight Lieutenant Anthony Hill remained at RAF Benson for the rest of the war, analyzing thousands more reconnaissance photographs, tracking supply lines and troop movements across occupied Europe. He rarely spoke about the Peenemünde photograph, even years later. When asked, he would only say that it was one frame among many,
as if diminishing his role in what followed. But those who worked with him knew differently. They knew that Hill had spent 4 hours that day staring at images of German coastline, refusing to stop, refusing to dismiss the strange cylindrical shape as a storage tank or construction equipment. He had trusted his instincts, he had made the call, and because of that, the war had changed. Sarah Oliver continued her work at Medmenham, eventually leading the entire photographic interpretation unit. After the war, she rarely discussed her role in identifying the V2 threat, and her contributions remained classified for decades. It wasn't until the 1970s that historians began to piece together the full story of Peenemünde, the reconnaissance missions, and the analysts who translated shadows and shapes into strategic intelligence. By then, Oliver was retired, living quietly in the English countryside. When asked about her work during the war, she said only that she had looked at pictures and tried to understand what they meant. It was a profound understatement. Wing Commander Douglas Kendall survived the war and later wrote about the challenges of photographic intelligence, emphasizing the importance of persistence, attention to detail, and the willingness to question what seemed obvious. He often cited the Peenemünde case as an example of how a single overlooked detail could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. Kendall believed that the raid on Peenemünde had saved tens of thousands of lives, not by stopping the V2 program entirely, but by disrupting it at a critical moment, forcing the Germans to rebuild in secret, under pressure, with fewer resources and less time. The delay, Kendall argued, was everything.
The photograph itself, frame 44, was eventually declassified and is now part of the Imperial War Museum's collection. It sits in an archive, a fragile piece of film that once held the weight of a nation's survival. Visitors can view it on request, though few do. It's not a dramatic image, no explosions, no soldiers, just a strip of German coastline rendered in black and white, with a small cylindrical object resting on a concrete ramp. To the untrained eye, it's almost boring, but to those who understand its context, it's one of the most important photographs of the Second World War. In the end, the story of Peenemünde is not a story of technology or rockets or even war. It's a story about attention, about the quiet, exhausting work of people who spent their days staring at photographs, measuring shadows, counting rail cars, and trying to see what others had missed. It's about the patience required to study frame after frame after frame, knowing that most of them would reveal nothing, but that one, just one, might reveal everything. And it's about the courage it takes to speak up when you see something that doesn't belong, even when you're not certain, even when the implications are terrifying. Hill saw that shape on the ramp and didn't look away. Oliver confirmed it and pushed for more reconnaissance. Kendall demanded action. And because of them, the raid happened, the facility burned, the program was delayed, and history took a different path. Not a perfect path. People still died, rockets still fell, but a path where the outcome was no longer inevitable, where the future remained open, where one photograph, studied by the right person at the right moment, became the fulcrum on which the war tipped. On a quiet morning in June 1943, Flight Lieutenant Hill sat alone in a darkened room and saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A shape that shouldn't be there, a weapon that shouldn't exist. And in that moment, without fully realizing it, he looked into the future and changed it.